Hey everybody, Chuck Marone with Strong Towns here. Yesterday there was an article in the New York Times about the property tax, and it called it something like the quiet killer. No, it wasn't quite that bad. It was like this subtle problem, like get rid of the property tax. And it raised a lot of really good points. I mean, it pointed out a lot of the inequities, particularly on racial lines, that come with the property tax. I want to share with you something that is maybe a little bit deeper, a little bit more nuanced. Take a step back and look at the property tax, because my friend Joe Minicozzi over at Urban 3, we partnered with them. They did the work. We did the writing up about it, looking at property tax systems across North Carolina. And this is work that has been mirrored in other places. We've studied, we've seen. The property tax works off of what is called an assessment. The government who's doing the taxing, in my area here, it's the county. In North Carolina, it was the county. That's pretty standard. Goes out and makes a determination of how much a property is worth. They send out the assessor. The assessor looks at the property and makes a comparison, all this stuff. They evaluate how much it's worth, and then that is an amount. It's the value of the land and the value of everything that's been built on it. You're then taxed based on that value. So if you have properties worth $100,000, you get taxed a certain amount. If it's worth $200,000, you get taxed generally double that amount. The property tax has a certain amount of discretion that goes along with it, right? The discretion is not in the taxation rate, but it is in the assessment amount. And in looking at many properties, Urban 3 uncovered and has some really powerful data showing a trend that holds true across states, jurisdictions, assessors. It's basically like a truism that we see reflected everywhere we've looked. The lower your property is valued, the more likely it is to be valued correctly or overvalued by the assessor. The higher your property is valued, the more likely it is to be undervalued by the assessor. And the higher you go, the more dramatic that undervaluation is. I just said a whole lot. Let me say this in a tweet kind of thing. The very wealthiest property owners, the very richest properties, get a massive tax break through the property tax system, while the poorest properties, the least affluent, the lowest value properties, have their taxes artificially higher than they should be. The poor are subsidizing the rich, to the extent that poor people live in poor properties and wealthy people live in wealthy properties, which is not a universal, but it's pretty close to a universal, right? The poor subsidize the rich through property tax system. We've seen properties where, say someone, the assessor's work is hard to check, right? Like, what's your property worth today? What's my house worth today? You don't really know. The way you know is if you put it on the market and sold it. Someone's going to buy it. But I've lived in my house for 7 years. I lived in my prior house for 20 years before that. You don't get like a transaction regularly so the market can update. What you do is you find comparables and you look around. So there's a bit of subjectivity. The best way to determine how a property is valued is to look at its sale price. And here's the interesting thing about the work that Urban 3 did. They would look at how the assessor reacted to a sale price. So let's say, and I'm just going to use rough numbers here. Let's say that the assessor had the property assessed at $100,000. This is worth $100,000. And then the property owner went out and sold it, and someone paid $200,000 for it. Well, the assessor was likely to look at that and then adjust the property up. The assessor would look at that, say, it was 100, it sold for 200, we're going to make it 200,000. If the property was, let's say, 10 million assessed, and it sold for 20 million, the assessor generally looked at that and said, all right, we had it assessed at 10, it sold at 20 million, we're going to make it 11. I'm not exaggerating. At the very high end of the spectrum, even when you had data, even when you had information that showed the actual market value, like here's a transaction, the assessors were reluctant to adjust that upward. The poorest properties subsidize the wealthiest properties. You can actually see this. We plotted it up and looked, and you can see here are the properties that are being overcharged. Here's the properties that are getting the break. Why is it this way? There's a whole bunch of reasons, and I think the New York Times, they point out a lot of things that I think have some validity and some truth. The one that I hadn't heard before, but is obvious once you look at it, is that oftentimes in the poorer white neighborhoods, in the wealthier white neighborhoods, they wouldn't go out and reassess, so they would just keep you kind of anchored at a lower value. And in the white neighborhoods, the properties were appreciating faster than in the black neighborhoods. And so over time, as you didn't reassess, you didn't go out and readjust, the disparity grew, right? The white people got wealthier than the black people, but the black people are still paying a higher proportion of taxes than they otherwise would. I actually think that in most cases, because that doesn't happen everywhere, assessors generally are pretty good about going out and reassessing. The thing that we see happening all the time is the appeals process, right? How do you appeal your assessment? If the assessor got it wrong, you have to show up at a meeting, you have to show up with data, you have to explain to an elected board why the assessor's wrong. It's not an easy process. That person has, all this data at their fingers. They have kind of the assumption of authority and what have you. If you are, let's say, less affluent, less connected, have fewer resources, and I think this is important, the actual amount you have to gain is not that great, right? Maybe you can lower your taxes by $50, maybe you can lower your taxes by $70. The idea of showing up and fighting the assessor is just not worth your time. It's not something you're likely to succeed at. It's going to take you a lot of energy, and if you win, you're going to save a little bit, right? If you are a wealthy property owner, if you own that $20 million property and you'd like it assessed at $11 million, it's worth it to you to hire the team of attorneys, the team of property appraisers, and whatever you have to do. Show up, make the assessor's life hell, make the elected official's life hell, be there at the meeting, make your case, get your thing lowered. Assessors don't like to deal with that. They don't want that fight. And so what they do is they nickel and dime thousands of poor people to give a little bit of money to a handful of wealthy people that they don't like to deal with. There are ways we can make this more transparent. There are ways that, I've seen assessors' offices a decade ago who were still using crayon drawings, still using like note cards, right? We can modernize a lot of this stuff. If Zillow can give you a good estimate of what your property is worth, the assessor can do a better job than they're doing right now. We can make a lot of this transparent. We can make a lot of this more defensible. And the reality is it's in local government's interest to have properties correctly appraised. Local governments are giving up often hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions in some cases dollars because their properties are being misappraised. Don't come to me and say, oh, tax the rich, they're not paying their fair share. You've got a current tax system that's supposed to tax everybody equally. Go out and do it.